All right, so if you could start by just telling us your name and school district.
Yeah, my name is Meenakshi Mukherjee, and I teach at Davison Elementary Middle School, which is a part of Detroit Public Schools Community District.
Great. And what do you teach at Davison?
I teach eighth grade ELA and social studies.
Eighth graders.
Yeah.
Fun. Yeah. Um, and could you tell us, do you have a union affiliation?
Yeah, I am a proud member of the Detroit Federation of Teachers.
Great. And also, if you could just tell us a little bit before we get started on talking about the pandemic, with telling us just a little bit about your school, the demographics of your school community.
Yeah, so Davison is located in Town in Detroit. The student population is a mix of Bangladeshi students and Black students. This is my second year in the district. I worked at charter schools in the city prior to this. And so it's been a really wonderful experience working within the public school district in Detroit. I've learned a lot. We have a pretty large staff. We have about, I want to say, um, 60 teachers, not including like support staff. So that would take our staff up into probably the hundreds. And yeah, and I've taught middle school while I've been there. And my first year there, I taught middle school science. This year I'm teaching, like I said, ELA and social studies. So yeah, definitely learning a lot about education in the city and like where the district has been and where it's going now. So it's been a really great experience so far.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're just going to jump into the COVID stuff. And my first question is, when was it that you realized that the COVID-19 pandemic was really going to affect your school and the entire Detroit Public Schools community district?
Yeah. So I don't know if I can pinpoint a moment. I had actually been on I was on full release from my professional duties for the semester. I was doing an organizing fellowship for DFT second semester last year. And so I was actually out of the classroom starting in February. And I was traveling to different school locations, talking to our members. And so it I think was probably that week when I had been following COVID news. My husband is also a teacher, and a lot of my close friends are teachers, and so and it was kind of like no, like we're not. That's not like no. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh yeah, that Thursday night when the calls started rolling in, and it was kind of like when you're waiting for a snow day to happen. But instead it was like 3 weeks of no school. And so everyone, it wasn't the same like excitement that you get from a snow day. It was kind of like a lingering, like unsettling feeling of the unknown. So I don't think it was actually until that Thursday, but I remember when they made the call for the time off up until after spring break. I had like a very certain feeling that we wouldn't be going back to school for the school year. So yeah.
That's really interesting. And given that you were on release starting in February, just before this hit, I'm curious as to for the last 2 months that it ended up being of the school year, how did that work for you? Did you end up reaching out to any of your students or families, or were you working with teachers at different schools? And I feel like you might have gotten a really interesting kind of bird's eye view of how things were going for different school communities from the position you were in.
Yeah, so I actually ended up working both jobs once the shutdown happened. I was organizing our members and reaching out to staff, and then I was also doing my full teaching position because it was online, and so I could sit at my computer, I could teach my classes, I could plan for my classes, and then I could also take time to reach out to our staff. And so it was. Yeah, I did I got to I was able to like get a temperature check of how folks are feeling around the district. Our district encompasses folks from all walks of life. You have folks who were being incredibly impacted by the shutdown and by COVID. You had people who were definitely less impacted and more removed, but still entrenched in the fact that they had to now teach online and that their whole profession was being moved. And so, yeah, and then I also, was keeping in touch with my kids and teaching them and the families that we work with and hearing how they were being affected by it and trying to support them that way. Yeah, so it was, I definitely had an interesting position where I was supporting all parts of our district as the shutdown occurred. So, yeah.
That sounds intense and exhausting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I at first I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. I get to because I was very hesitant to take a semester off teaching because I love my kids and teaching, and I think it's important that kids have that stability there. But I also knew that doing organizing work is really important for the longevity and stability of our district and ultimately for our kids. So yeah, I was like, oh, I can teach and I can organize now. And then I was like, about 3 weeks, and I was like, oh wow, this is really exhausting. But yeah, no, it was really interesting to be able to do both those roles at the time.
For sure. And how did the students and parents, how were they coping with everything that happened, and how did you adapt to this virtual learning on the drop of a hat? You had to all of a sudden start this virtual learning thing. How did that work for you? What worked? What didn't? Curious.
Yeah. So I teach 8th grade, so my kids definitely were. The transition onto an online platform was a lot easier in many ways, just because my students are older and definitely more independent in that way. We struggled with accessibility to computers and Wi-Fi, internet connection. Also things just space and time was hard. A lot of my students have siblings that were also in school, and so I would have one of my students on one of our class calls, and you could hear their sibling, a couple feet away from them, also on a class call. And so just even thinking through the simple logistics like that was difficult. A few of my students did lose family members due to COVID, which was really difficult. And just, all of our communities are so close knit, and so a loss for one is a loss for many. And so I think a lot about how this is just a very, very traumatic for all of our students and all people involved. And so addressing that and taking care of kids and families that way. Lots of our staff members at Davison, did grocery outreach and helped set up tech for families that needed support. So there were lots of people on the ground also doing work to help our kids and families. But yeah, it was definitely a transition. And I think that one thing I think about a lot is none of these things are, the accessibility issues, these equity issues, none of them are new. They all existed prior to COVID. And teachers have been dealing with these issues prior to COVID. And so I think one thing that is incredibly beautiful about teachers and educators and staff members in buildings is how they're able to adapt and how they're able to respond to these huge gaps in the systems. And they shouldn't have to, right? Our systems shouldn't have these huge gaps. But I do think that it's amazing how folks are able to fill in and adjust when needed.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. It's one of those things where it's both enraging and beautiful at the same time, the types of outreach that your staff was doing above and beyond, and the fact that you do have to take these roles on that are much more than an 8th grade ELA teacher.
Right.
Is there like a particular instance or memorable moment with a staff member or a student or family that really sticks with you for the last few months of the school year?
Yeah. I I had this, and I think about this a lot as we are entering conversations about returning to school, and like our priorities around what kids need and what families need. It was really late one night, and I got a message on our district uses Microsoft Teams. I got a message on Microsoft Teams from one of my students, and they said, "I'm so sorry, Ms. Mukherjee. But I've been missing our online classes, and my dad is in the hospital and they don't think he's going to survive." And it was just like a very real moment of like, what are our priorities right now? And that student's father ended up passing away a few days later. But just the fact that like the student reached out to me to apologize for not being present for an online class for like 3 days. Was just it was just like a moment of reckoning with like what are we actually doing here, and what actually matters, and what is going to matter to this child in 10 years. What is this child going to remember in 10 years from now? Is she going to remember that, you know, I missed 3 days of 8th grade online? And so, and then just the speed with which that student caught back up. And I don't even really like using the term caught back up. Or just like started engaging again with class after this incredibly devastating event in her life was really disheartening in how we're like handling this whole situation as a society, really. So yeah, that sticks out to me. It's not a very happy memory, but yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, I think it these 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 really traumatic things happening, I do think it's hopefully going to cause a larger reckoning over, yeah, what does it say about our society as a whole that this student would be so freaked out about missing some days of class when that's in that particular instance. I mean, it's like there's something that's gone seriously wrong
Yeah.
for a long time, you know. Whew. Um, well, it's interesting how you linked that a little bit to this reopening, thinking through that as you think about reopening, because that's my last question for you is to reopen, you know, if you had a magic wand, what do you think needs to happen for schools to be able to actually safely reopen? And also just what do you think should happen, I guess, a month from now?
Yeah.
You know, what do you think is going to happen, and what do you think should happen, given where things are right now?
Yeah, I think my answer to this shifts a lot. There's so many unknowns. I think for me, my biggest concern is there have been so many promises that are still undelivered on. There are so many things that educators, support staff, anybody, kids, families, anybody who has any contact with the school building has been told this will happen, and then that particular thing never actualizes. And so for me, it's this lack of trust that exists, and I think we can talk all day long about safety precautions and procedures that will be in place, but I know from working in schools that things have been said that will be in place that never actually are in place. And so part of me, you know, sits here and says, well, you know, here's my list of demands, but really what I want is like accountability factor, right? You can give me a list of things you say are going to happen, but at this point, I don't believe it. And so what's going to hold the powers that be to that list of demands or promises? I think that we need to see cases. We need to see no new cases for 14 days before it's safe for our students and for staff to return. I also think that we need to make sure that we're going to protect our most vulnerable in our buildings, and I mean, and everybody who walks through the building, right? There should be no discussion. I really dislike the discussion around, well, like kids don't transmit it, or like, oh, but like most people recover. It just, I don't want another child to have to apologize for missing out on moments of their education as they have a family member die. It's not something people should have to pick between. They should not have to pick between their lives and their livelihood or their education. And so, yeah, and I also just think that we can do all of this better. And right now, I think we're trying to return to a system that never worked. And I just constantly am like, why? Right? Why are we doing this? Why are we not taking this as a moment to reevaluate what teaching and learning looks like, as opposed to trying to like take this square peg and jam it into this like circle hole that just no longer exists, right? The conditions around learning in a school building no longer exist the way they ever have. Even if we return back in person, it's still not going to be the same as March 12th, 2020. That world doesn't exist anymore. And I think about that a lot, right? If for whatever reason I needed to go back and start teaching September 8th, my first 2 weeks of school would look absolutely different. Because I would have hundreds of children coming into my room who have faced loss and death and massive trauma. It's not just a welcome to 8th grade. It is a, wow, like, it's just completely different. So I think like, I think we need to actually think through what has happened and what needs to happen. And there needs to be accountability. There needs to be workers' voices included, not just input, but actual authentic decision making occurring from the people who are on the ground doing the work. And so I think those are things that stick out to me the most as I think about returning.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And that pretty much brings us to the end. But before we get off, is there anything else you'd like to say before I pause the recording?
I don't know. I think I covered it mostly. Yeah, I think that this is, I was really hopeful back in March that this would be kind of a point for reimagining what education looks like in our communities. And it's hard to watch our leaders just really like resist any sort of change in that way. And to do it in the name of like what's best for kids is what I think is so toxic to everything that is going on. And so, because I think that there's something that's much better for kids and families and staff. And so, yeah, I believe in the power of, the people. And I do think that, I mean, we have to figure out a better way. That's ultimately, what it comes down to. There has to be a better way. And I have hope that we will find that better way sooner or later. So, yeah.